Have you ever wandered into a place that seemed perfectly normal at first, only to discover something far darker lurking beneath the surface? In today's video, we'll dive into 3 chilling stories that will make you question the seemingly harmless places you visit. From eerie school gardens to abandoned buildings, these tales are not just unsettling, they're downright disturbing. Welcome to Disturbia. I never expected my first year of teaching to end in tragedy. I had always heard about the difficulties of managing a classroom, the long hours, the stress, but nothing prepared me for what I witnessed. Nothing prepared me for the day one of my students died in front of me, and yet, somehow, never left. It was the most disturbing experience of my life. It was my first year as an English teacher at Maplewood High School, a mid-sized school in a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened, or so I thought. I was assigned to teach sophomore literature, and my last period of the day was a rowdy but generally good-hearted bunch. One student stood out from the start, Daniel Carter. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and sat at the back of the classroom, always scribbling in a notebook. He never spoke unless called upon, and even then, his answers were short and distant. His eyes seemed hollow, as if he were carrying a weight far beyond his years. At first, I assumed he was just shy or struggling with personal issues, but something about him always felt off. It happened 2 months into the school year. We were discussing Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, a story about ritualistic sacrifice in a small town. When I called on Daniel, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion in his face. "Do you think sacrifice is necessary?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. In the context of the story, or in real life? He smirked, an unsettling expression. Both. The room went silent. The other students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Before I could respond, he looked back down at his notebook and continued writing. That night, as I graded papers, I noticed Daniel's essay. It wasn't about the lottery. Not really. It was a detailed account of a boy being sacrificed in a school classroom by his own teacher. After that, strange things kept happening. I would find pages torn from his notebook left on my desk, each one describing morbid scenes. A student bleeding out in an empty classroom, a teacher standing over them, a chalkboard covered in cryptic symbols. At first, I dismissed it as a morbid imagination, maybe a cry for help. I reported my concerns to the school counselor, but Daniel never showed any outward signs of distress. "Some kids just like dark stories," the counselor told me. "It's probably nothing." I wasn't so sure. Then came the day. Everything changed. It was an ordinary Thursday. We were halfway through the period when Daniel suddenly gasped. His body stiffened, his chair scraping against the floor as he clutched his chest. His eyes went wide with horror. "Help me," he croaked. Before I could move, he collapsed. His body convulsed violently before going still. A girl screamed. The class erupted into chaos. I rushed to him, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. I don't remember much of what happened next. The paramedics arrived. The principal ushered the students out. They tried to resuscitate him, but it was too late. Daniel Carter was dead. I went home that night in shock, replaying the moment over and over. I barely slept. The next morning, I forced myself to return to school, expecting grief, mourning, maybe a memorial. But when I entered my classroom, I froze. Daniel's seat was occupied. He was sitting there, scribbling in his notebook, as if nothing had happened. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The other students filed in, chatting as if everything was normal. No one seemed to notice Daniel, even as he continued writing, the scratch of his pen impossibly loud. I stared. Daniel? No response. I looked at the other students. Do you see him? They stared at me confused. See who? One girl asked. My blood ran cold. Daniel slowly lifted his head. He smiled. You do. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Grief, stress, exhaustion, anything but the reality before me. But it wasn't just that day. Every morning, Daniel was there. Every night, I found pages from his notebook on my desk, filled with disturbing descriptions of my growing paranoia. I began to hear whispers when the room was empty. I saw movement in the darkened halls when no one was there. My dreams were filled with Daniel standing at the foot of my bed watching. Then the deaths began. The first was a student who had mocked Daniel before his death. He was found in his home, his throat slit, his own handwriting covering the walls in words no one could understand. Then another, a teacher who had failed Daniel the previous year. She fell down a flight of stairs, her last words a frantic, "He's here." I knew who was next. I tried to quit. The school wouldn't let me. The kids need stability, the principal insisted. We've had too much tragedy already. That night, I found a final note on my desk. 3 words, written in Daniel's handwriting. It's your turn. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I woke up in my classroom, alone, the room dark except for the moonlight filtering through the blinds. And Daniel was standing over me, his notebook open, reading aloud the final passage, the story of my own death. I tried to scream, but darkness swallowed me whole. The next morning, the principal entered the classroom to find my body at my desk, a pen clutched in my stiff fingers. On the chalkboard, in jagged writing, were the words, "Class dismissed." I used to think of school as a place of learning, of routine, of safety. I never imagined that a simple mistake, a moment of curiosity, could lead to something so horrific. What happened in that school still haunts me to this day. And no matter how hard I try to forget, the memory lingers, dark, unshakable, and deeply disturbing. It started with a rumor. There was always talk about locker hash 502, the one at the very end of the hallway by the old science lab. No one used it. No one even touched it. If you asked a teacher about it, they'd brush it off or change the subject. Some students claimed it had been welded shut years ago. Others said they'd seen something moving inside. I never cared much for ghost stories, but when my best friend Mark dared me to open it, I wasn't about to back down. "You won't do it," he grinned. "You're all talk." I rolled my eyes. If it's locked, how am I supposed to open it? But I didn't need to. When I placed my hand on the door, it shifted, unlocked. A sudden chill ran through me. The hallway felt unnaturally quiet. But I had an audience now. Other students watching, waiting. I couldn't back out. I pulled it open. The smell hit me first. A thick, rancid stench of rot and something else, something old. I gagged, covering my nose. Inside, a bundle of fabric sat crumpled at the bottom, like an abandoned coat. No, not a coat. A hand. A human hand, stiff and discolored, poking out from beneath the fabric. Someone screamed. The crowd scattered. Mark stood frozen, his face drained of all color. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. That's when the hand twitched. The school went into full lockdown. The police were called. We were all questioned. Our phones confiscated to stop any pictures from spreading. The body belonged to a girl. They wouldn't tell us her name, but I overheard the officers whispering. She had been there for years. No records, no missing persons reports. It was like she had never existed, except for one thing. The locker had always been welded shut. The janitor swore up and down that it was impossible for anyone to open it. The principal looked sick, muttering to herself about mistakes of the past. And yet, somehow, I had opened it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her hand, hearing the faint creak of the locker door. At exactly 3:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. One new message. No number. Just 2 words. Let me out. I dropped my phone. My hands were shaking. I tried to wake Mark, who had crashed at my place, but he was completely still. When I shook him harder, he let out a strangled gasp and bolted upright. I saw her, he panted. She was in my dream. She was screaming. We stared at each other in terror. The next morning, Mark didn't show up to school. I called his house. No answer. By lunchtime, the rumors had already started. His parents had found him in his bed, pale and unmoving. No signs of injury. No medical explanation. It was as if he had just stopped. I sat through my classes in a daze. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand reaching for me. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I heard a locker creak open behind me. That night, another message. Almost free. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I stayed after school, waiting until the halls were empty. When I finally reached the locker, my breath caught in my throat. It was open. Inside, the body was gone. And then, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak as the locker door swung shut behind me. The last thing I saw was a shadow moving toward me, a whisper curling around my ear like icy breath. Your turn. The next morning, students whispered about a new rumor. A different locker, one that was now permanently shut, its number scrubbed from existence. No one remembered my name. No one remembered Mark. Just another forgotten story, waiting for the next fool to open the wrong door. The nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I found myself trapped in a long, endless hallway lined with lockers. No doors, no windows, just rows and rows of lockers stretching into infinity. And somewhere behind me, always just out of sight, I could hear that locker creaking open. One night, I saw something new. Mark was there, standing at the end of the hallway, his back turned. His posture was unnatural, stiff, his head tilted at a wrong angle. Mark? My voice barely echoed in the silence. Slowly, he turned, and my breath hitched. His eyes were hollow, sunken pits of darkness, and his mouth was moving, but no sound came out. I stepped forward, and that's when I noticed it. His lips were forming the words. Help me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my hands shaking. My phone vibrated on my nightstand. Almost time. The next day, my reflections started to change. At first, it was small things. A flicker of movement in the mirror that didn't match mine. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. But then, it got worse. In the school bathroom, I turned on the sink and looked up at the mirror. My reflection was smiling at me. I wasn't smiling. I bolted out of the bathroom. But the moment I turned the corner, I found myself back at the hallway with the lockers. The school was empty. The air was heavy, suffocating. The lights flickered, buzzing overhead. And then, the locker at the end of the hall creaked open. A hand reached out. My vision blurred. My body wasn't listening. I felt myself walking forward, step by step, unable to stop. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, consuming me. The last thing I remember was cold fingers closing around my wrist, pulling me inside. The next day, a new rumor spread through the school. A new locker had appeared at the end of the hallway. No one knew who it belonged to. No one had ever seen it before, and no one noticed that I was missing. It all started in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, the school garden. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, it was a tiny patch of land behind the building, covered in overgrown weeds, where the only things that seemed to thrive were the occasional stray cats and the thick silence that surrounded it. I used to love it there. It was my escape. The world outside was chaos, homework piling up, friends arguing, teachers demanding more, and everyone around me trying to be something they weren't. The garden, though, that was different. It was where I could sit, breathe, and think in peace. A corner of quiet in a world that was never still enough. That's where I met Emma. Emma was quiet, the kind of girl who didn't say much, but when she did, it was always something worth listening to. She wasn't popular, but she wasn't an outcast either. We both ended up there during our lunch breaks, drawn by the same need to escape the noise of school. We'd sit on the old wooden bench, the one that was so cracked it felt like it might fall apart any second, and talk. Most days, we'd joke around. Other days, we'd talk about our future, about what we wanted out of life, or sometimes we just sat in silence, letting the rustling leaves and the chirping birds fill the space between us. But one day, everything changed. It was a warm autumn afternoon, and we'd just finished talking about our plans for the weekend when Emma went quiet. I looked over at her. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me, something in the garden's overgrown corner. "What's wrong?" I asked, turning to look. "I think I saw something," she whispered. I laughed, thinking she was just messing with me. "Saw something? Like a ghost?" Emma's eyes were wide, scanning the dark corner of the garden where the ivy-covered fence met the wall of the school building. "I saw someone watching us." I shrugged it off. It was probably just some random student or a teacher passing by. But there was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake off. Something felt off. The next day, Emma wasn't at school. She didn't answer her messages, didn't show up for class. I figured she was just sick or maybe skipping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. Something bad. I went to the garden alone that afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the tangled mess of weeds and dead flowers. As I walked in, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned around, but no one was there, just the wind rustling through the trees. And then I saw it, a single red rose, fresh and perfect, sitting in the middle of the garden, right where Emma and I had sat the day before. It was out of place. The rest of the garden was still a mess, overgrown and wild. But that rose, so vivid, so perfect, stuck out like a sore thumb. I knelt down to get a closer look. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The ground around the rose wasn't just dirt. It was soft, like it had been recently disturbed. Someone had been here. Someone had planted that rose. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I couldn't leave. I had to know what was going on. The next day, Emma still wasn't at school, but I kept going back to the garden, day after day. Each time, something new. A flower here, a trimmed bush there, the bench wiped clean of dust like someone had been sitting there. But there was no one in sight, except for me and the eerie silence that seemed to hang over the place like a dark cloud. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of Emma, but there was nothing. She had just vanished. I started to feel paranoid, like I was the only one who noticed it, like I was the only one who could see that the garden was changing. Then, one morning, I found it a body. It wasn't Emma, but it was someone I recognized. Jared, one of the guys from my class. He was lying in the garden, his body twisted unnaturally, as though something had broken him. His eyes were wide open, staring into the sky, but there was no life in them. The most chilling part? His mouth was open, like he was trying to scream but couldn't. I ran out of the garden, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew it wasn't normal. The school went into lockdown. The authorities came, and the whole place became a frenzy of police cars and flashing lights. But the garden remained. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, not at first. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started to piece things together. People had been disappearing, small disappearances that no one seemed to notice at first. But they added up. People who had been near the garden, people who had been there at the wrong time, had just vanished. And then there were the roses. Every time someone went missing, a new rose would appear in the garden, as if marking their death. And that's when it hit me. The garden wasn't just a place. It was something else. A place where the line between life and death was blurred. A place where things didn't just grow, they took. At first, I thought I was going crazy. Maybe it was the stress from everything happening around me. Maybe I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this had been happening for a long time. The whispers around school about the garden, about the weird energy it had, they weren't just rumors. The garden had always been alive, waiting for someone to notice. The more I looked into it, the more I uncovered. I spoke to some of the older students, those who'd been at the school longer than I had. Some of them claimed to have known about the garden's strange powers for years. They talked about old legends, about how the garden was built on cursed land, how it was a place where sacrifices were made in the past. Some even said the garden was cursed by someone who had died there long ago. But no one seemed to believe in it anymore. No one except for me. I tried to tell the authorities, but by then, they thought I was just another student caught up in the hysteria. They didn't believe me, and soon, no one did. It was the night I decided to go back into the garden alone that I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't a person, but something darker. It shifted between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. When I turned my head, it disappeared. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The garden was still, silent, alive. I could feel its presence, though, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't seem to exist in that place anymore. It was like the garden had consumed it, swallowed it whole. That's when I saw the roses again. More of them, growing from the dirt, as if they were blooming from the ground itself, curling around each other in an unnatural dance. I felt a pull, a call, like the garden wanted me to stay. But I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling like I was running from something far worse than any nightmare. I didn't look back. The next day, Emma's body was found in the garden, her eyes wide open, her mouth frozen in a scream that would never be heard. That's when I knew. The garden wasn't just a place to escape. It was a place where lives were stolen, where people were taken, their souls consumed by something darker than anything we could imagine. Now, I stay away from the garden. I don't know who or what controls it, but am not stupid enough to go back and find out. I still hear the whispers sometimes, though, especially at night. A soft rustling in the trees, the sound of footsteps following me when no one is there. The garden is still out there, and it's waiting,